Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I think the establishment of such a center is a very good and timely idea. I will just very briefly introduce myself. My name is Michał Czerniawski, and I'm a data protection and cybersecurity attaché at the permanent representation of Poland to the EU. I also cover some other digital topics such as public sector information and a little bit of e-government, but I think I have a good background to discuss with you today cybersecurity. I see also that the other panelists are somehow data protection related, like their background also is a little bit in data protection, so I will try to make some links between cybersecurity, EU cybersecurity legislation and EU data protection law. I think one of the reasons why I'm here today is the discussion I had before with Vagelis at some point, and the idea of having a complex GDPR-style cybersecurity law on the EU level. So here I came basically to say to list some reasons for which I believe it won't happen anytime soon. So maybe we were like I'm coming here I think with this realistic approach and with some knowledge on how EU Council works and how the decision process on the EU level takes place, and what are the issues we have to address before we can reach a level where we can negotiate a EU cybersecurity regulation, although we have already, for example, Cybersecurity Act. So the reasons why we need cybersecurity are very simple. The digital single market and the online environment is constantly expanding, and there is a need for trust and for security online. So basically, this is something both data protection and cybersecurity have in common. We want to build a trusted environment, and we want users, we want data subjects to trust in digital and to use internet services. It is not possible without proper handling of personal data, and this is not possible if end users are at risk of some malicious activities, whether they can be hacked or they are not safe in cyberspace. Cybersecurity, in my personal opinion, is a little bit is an area which has much, maybe not much, but more layers than personal data protection. So what we do on the EU level, we deal not only with issues such as setting some basics principle, but also with funding. We also have a whole branch of cybersecurity, which is cyber diplomacy. So there are some processes that take place mainly in United Nations, in GGE committee. On the EU level here in Brussels, just member states coordinate and exchange views and often reach common position, but it's not that the majority of the processes are happening somewhere else. There is also the whole branch of cyber defense, which is outside, clearly outside of the scope of the EU law, because it is strictly related to the member states' defense. The current landscape in the field of cybersecurity is that we have two EU legislations that are already finished, that are already being applicable. This is a Cybersecurity Act and NIS Directive, and we have a third act that is currently under negotiations, which is the proposal for a regulation on European competence centers, and this third regulation deals strictly with financing and funding. So basically, EU wants to force member states to spend more money on research and innovation only in cybersecurity. And this is the purpose of this third negotiations, which I also have a pleasure to negotiate in the Council. There are some differences between cybersecurity and personal data, which are quite visible. So the process of harmonization in the field of cybersecurity started only recently, while with personal data protection we had OECD guidelines, we had Convention 108 in the 90s, then we had Directive 9546. So the process of harmonization, before we got GDPR, there were like years of harmonization. First, soft, like OECD guidelines were not binding, then Convention 108 you had to adhere to, then Directive 9546 that required implementation into the member states' law, and only then we have reached the level of harmonization that was provided in the GDPR. Next issue is that there are, and maybe because of this lack of harmonization, there are significant gaps between various member states. So some member states are obviously more advanced in the field of cybersecurity than other. The obvious example here is certification, where there are member states that for 20 years have owned national cybersecurity schemes, certification schemes, and there are some member states that even didn't launch this process and they don't have national certification, cyber certification center. Another important factor is the lack of legal basis. So this is something like with the GDPR and on all the laws on data protection, we have the basis in the treaties. It's Article 16, Para 1 of the Treaty of Functioning of EU. While cybersecurity, if we read the word cybersecurity, it's cyber and security. So we have to, there is this part of security which member states also argue with the Commission and with other institutions. Where is the border between what is within the EU law and what stays outside of the EU law? And it's clear that national security stays outside of the scope of the EU law. So whatever happens in the field of cybersecurity, it has to be approved by all the member states, and there must be will on the member states' side to proceed with some EU legislation. Also, cybersecurity needs to be often balanced with fundamental rights. So we have, for example, have an issues. We now, like the discussion, for example, we start discussion on an encryption in 5G networks, and we wonder whether there should be a lawful access guaranteed to the communication within 5G networks or not. We recently finished the work on Cybersecurity Act. Lucy was very much involved in the work when she was still a part of the Austrian team, and she was chairing the Horizontal Working Party on cyber issues. So we made some progress with respect to ENISA. So ENISA was the last EU agency that is responsible for cybersecurity, was the last EU agency without permanent mandate. So now, after the Cybersecurity Act is applicable, ENISA has a permanent mandate. But also, if you check Article 7 of the Cybersecurity Act, you will notice that it does not have operational competences. All the operational competences stay with national cybersecurity centers and national agencies responsible for cybersecurity. If you look at NIS Directive, and there is a NIS cooperation group established under Article 11 of the directive, and it works in the way where it is member states that chair the group, and Commission is acting more as a secretariat. So you have probably, if you are following the developments in the area of cybersecurity, you have noticed that this week risk assessment of 5G networks was published, but basically it's all governed by member states, and the Commission has, and NISA, they have more supportive role here. And then we are still in the process of negotiating the regulation on the European Competence Center and the network of national competence centers on cybersecurity. The main problem with this file is the issue of funding. So the question, how much money should member states or have to member states have to invest in developing cybersecurity on EU level. Basically, this is one of the reasons why this file is still under negotiations. Was not finalized. Here, I would want to give you an example. This was the risk assessment I mentioned earlier. It's an information from this week, on publishing the risk assessment of 5G network security, and I think it gives a good idea of how the cybersecurity now works on the EU level. So you have EU member states with the support of the European Commission and the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity published a report. So this is how it happens. There is the role of the EU still in the field of the cybersecurity is more consultative and more supportive. The risk assessment was published after the communication from the Commission. So Commission triggered the whole discussion, but the discussion was made by the EU member states within the framework of NIS cooperation group. So the framework was established in the EU law, but the whole discussion was chaired and conducted between the member states. So this is how the current landscape looks like with the NIS and NIS cooperation group. If you go to certification, again, we had a very lengthy discussion what to do with national certification schemes which are applicable currently. So the solution is that national certification schemes that were adopted before Cybersecurity Act became applicable stay in force until they are replaced by EU certificates, and that European Commission always can propose certification schemes, but member states also can propose a certification scheme, and that adherence to any EU certification schemes in cybersecurity is voluntary. This brings me to the finish of my intervention. I hope I was not too technical, but I tried to give some concrete examples of how it works now, going through NIS, through Cybersecurity Act, and through the negotiations of the European competence centers. The main problem, and I'm sorry, Vagelis, if I'm an advocate of the devil, but I think this is like, I'm triggering academic discussion, and I think, of course, at the end of the day, we may end up with some EU-wide binding cybersecurity regulation that regulates cybersecurity in a more complex way, but it's a long way ahead of us. Now we are at the stage of harmonization. Now we are at the stage of strengthening cooperation between member states. That is the purpose of NIS cooperation group. This is the purpose of the ECCG, so the group that consists of member states and discuss certification. And only when we really unify the practices, like reach common standards in many areas of cybersecurity, and only if the cooperation will be strong enough, then we can start talks about EU cybersecurity, unified cybersecurity law on the EU level. And obviously, let's see, like I think the cybersecurity is very high on the agenda of the new Commission. We already heard that the new unit, the Joint Cybersecurity Unit, will be established just to deal with the issue of cybersecurity. But as I said, like my conclusion is that only if we do our homework, so only if we focus now on better harmonization between member states and better cooperation between the member states, only when we achieve some successes in this field and only if this cooperation is really close, we can only then start talking about EU-wide cybersecurity, complex cybersecurity regulation. And so that's it from my side. Thank you for your attention. Yeah.